It's it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Joe. I'm really looking forward to this presentation, and I think it will resonate with a lot of people here. So when you're ready,
Ready?
off you go.
I'll say good evening.
Everybody should mute themselves.
Sorry, yes, I should do that. My mistake. So Joseph, I'm going to do this, and then you're going to need to unmute yourself after I've done it. So I'm going to mute you now, and then I'll ask you to unmute.
Push the sound.
There we are. Brilliant. Great. Thank you.
Okay, a little bit left, but I'll go ahead and introduce myself briefly. I'm an American, an organic chemist by training, with a PhD from the University of Wisconsin sometime in the last century. At its end, I began working with the International Center for Transdisciplinary Research in Paris and its first president, Basarab Niculescu. Niculescu had introduced me to the non-standard logic of another founder of CIRET, the Franco-Romanian thinker Stefan Lupascu. My first task was to make Lupascu's logical system available in English. This led to a first book, Logic and Reality, published by Springer in 2008. I'm sorry, I can't now move.
All right, I think just clicking on it will move it forwards. Just click on it.
Click on the slide.
On the slide, yeah.
Oh, too fast. Now I go backwards.
Arrows.
Arrows. Okay. So in a second book, Philosophy and Reality, written with the biologist and philosopher Andrei Igamberdiev, has just been completed and is in production also with Springer. I've also published 40-odd papers centered on this logic, mainly focused on the science and philosophy of information. I would like to thank Mark Johnson, Mike Horner, and Bob Bishop in reverse order of acquaintance for the opportunity to talk about this work with you. This chart summarizes some of the key people with whom I've been working directly and indirectly. In the areas of logic and information, I mention in particular Pedro Marwan, one of the founders of the Foundations of Information Science Group. In 2010, I began collaboration with Wu Kun, director of the International Center for the Philosophy of Information in Xi'an, China. Wu had been working for some 30 years as a pioneer in the field of the philosophy of information, totally independently of Luciano Floridi, the pioneer in this field in the West. As a scientist, the philosophical approaches of Lupascu, Niculescu, and Wu were congenial to me, as they included three things: a substantial degree of rigor, the elimination of the reductionist limitations of standard propositional logic, and openness to the ethical dimensions and implications of philosophy as well as science. Although the pursuit of pure science has undoubted benefits for knowledge, the justification for the kind of synthetic philosophy I'm involved in now is its possible contribution to the common good. Igamberdiev and I consider the true predecessors of what you're hearing about now, Heraclitus, the Chinese Chuang Tzu on the one hand, and on the other, Kant and Husserl. In our new book, we provide a novel interpretation of Husserl's well-known paper, Philosophy as Rigorous Science. In some measure, our theses meet the goal that Husserl set himself of establishing what is specifically philosophical about the natural and human sciences. Relevant to the entire presentation, its relation to system science and philosophy. I start with von Bertalanffy and Laszlo, and continue with people like Cliff Hooker, my friend and mentor Wolfgang Hofkirchner, and most recently Gianfranco Minati in Milan. In his major new book, From Collective Beings to Quasi-Systems, Minati goes far but beyond what he calls GOFs, good old-fashioned systematics, and makes the study of systems as essential to knowledge as I believe is the work of Lupasco. Other relevant work is by Lorenzo Magnani, head of the Laboratory for Computational Philosophy at the University of Pavia, author of Morality in a Technological World. Magnani is the editor of a book series entitled Sapere, Studies in Applied Philosophy, Epistemology, and Rational Ethics. Some of you will recognize sapere means to know in Italian. All of my work could be considered as applied philosophy. The next chart lists the major subjects I will discuss today. I will start with the basic properties of logic and reality, LIR. Next, I will discuss the central role in knowledge played by information and information science, as the properties of information exemplify the operation of logic and reality. The next subject is the philosophy of information and its characterization as natural philosophy, using the principles of LIR. I then suggest that LIR is the basis for a new understanding of natural intelligence and some of the characteristics of what an intelligent society might be. I conclude with a recapitulation of the key things that logic and reality is and is not, and what it can and cannot do. My scientific philosophical perspective is a process view of nature and change. I define two kinds of thermodynamic change, linear and interactive, where linear refers to single element energetic processes in a simple gradient, like falling water. Interactive change describes the evolution of complex processes whose elements are mutually determining. They are related such that the actualization of one implies the potentialization of the other, alternately and reciprocally, without either ever going to the ideal limits of 0 or 1, except in trivial, simple cases. One can list the movements of opposing elements of a process as follows: movement from actuality to potentiality and vice versa, movement from identity, unity, homogeneity, to diversity, multiplicity, heterogeneity, and vice versa, and the emergence of new entities from the midpoint where the degrees of actuality and potentiality are equal. These rules operate at all thermodynamic levels of reality and define logic and reality as a non-truth functional logic, allowing inferences about the further evolution of processes to be made. Please note, therefore, that this logic cannot be applied to any of the work that we heard about yesterday. All of what's going on there is going on at the quantum or subquantum level, and my logic does not apply there. Where it does apply is to something like the following list of elements, and these are not sentences, but epistemological or ontological entities, molecules, theories, or people, individuals, or groups. On the chart, I've listed some of the pairs of opposites, the most critical for this discussion. I have tried to emphasize the non-Markovian process nature of some of these logical elements. In his book, The Incomplete Nature, the biologist Terence Deacon extends a concept of energy derived from statistical mechanics to yield a description of complex processes in which absence plays a critical role in the emergence of living systems, mind, and information. He shows how an interactive operation of Shannon, Boltzmann, and Darwinian entropy must be taken into account in information. The approaches of Deakin and LIR are complementary. Both refer to a phenomenon that is not, or not yet fully, there. LIR shows that presence, actuality, and absence, potentiality, in such processes must be related dynamically. Information is best described as a complex emergent phenomenon at the intersection of technology, science, and philosophy. The relevance of the first two disciplines have been accepted for some time, but only in the last 20 years has the pioneering work of Luciano Floridi and Woo Kun begun to be recognized. In a series of recent papers in English, some of them with me, Woo has demonstrated the relevance of a philosophical perspective based on considerations of the unique and ubiquitous properties of information, better information processes, and the convergence of philosophy and science in general as a consequence. Woo has characterized his philosophy of information as a meta-philosophy, since it defines ways in which all theories are constituted and operate in the evolving informational world. Following his outline for information, one may construct an informational model of knowledge that includes as its proper parts information, science, and its data. The essential point is to recognize what brings together, rather than what differentiates or separates, the epistemological and ontological elements of information. In the LIR view, these concepts are part and parcel of information science. The philosophical view of process elements as information or informational rejoins a scientific view of these elements as energetic processes. This grounds the convergence Woo proposes of information science and philosophy toward a unified science philosophy of information. The principles of logic and reality apply again here. In such a USPI, the individual components do not lose their identity, but remain in an active dialectic relation to one another. One's mind alternates between a predominantly philosophical and predominantly scientific universe. This next slide is about the informational attitude that Woo Kun has defined, and we can come back to this later. The key point is that of an attitude associated with the science philosophy of information is to give proper value to its qualitative, non-measurable, and non-computable components. It should never be said that qualitative relations and inequalities, which follow the rules of logic and reality, are more important or necessary than quantitative equalities, only that they are no less fundamental. In my concept, logical philosophy and reality is, logic and reality is a way of delimiting natural philosophy, which is what Anpa is all about. It is also currently being redefined by Marcin Schroeder and Jordana Dodic-Jankovic, as well as by Igor Beriev and me. Natural philosophy is a non-technical domain of knowledge that tells us something real about the world, consistent with our best science, physical, biological, and cognitive. Speculative philosophy can always illuminate eternal questions, such as what it means to be a thinking being in a non-thinking universe, but it cannot in itself be other than part of philosophy tout court. The ontological turn in philosophy is a term of art that designates dissatisfaction with descriptions of reality based on analytical semantic criteria of truth. I consider that philosophy and reality is part of the current ontological turn. These views of philosophy, information, intelligence, and society are thus part of natural philosophy. Wu has explained why the philosophy of information should be considered a meta-philosophy, as I said before. It contains or implies all other individual philosophies, such as the philosophy of science, the philosophy of history, and so on. The meta-philosophy of information is thus similar, if not identical, to natural philosophy and/or philosophy in reality. In the conception of the major contemporary philosopher Rafael Capurro, natural philosophy deals with the question about nature as a whole, stated by beings, ourselves, who find themselves in nature without having the possibility of a holistic view of being, since we are in nature and not beyond it. However, the fact that we are able to ask this question means that we have some kind of pre-knowledge about nature as a whole. At the same time, this pre-knowledge is problematic. Otherwise, we would not ask the question and could not become natural philosophers, standard or alternative. Intelligence is a common term which, like information, is capable of being used in a wide variety of senses. The quite recent development of a discipline of intelligence science is relevant to, I think, to your alternative natural philosophy. It was developed primarily, if not exclusively, by a group of Chinese scholars who were dissatisfied with the current overemphasis on artificial intelligence. And not because AI is not a major new and important field of knowledge, but because it was not accompanied by equivalent emphasis on human and other animal intelligence. Human intelligence has tended to be studied by statistical and reductionist methods, of which the epitome is the so-called intelligent quotient, IQ. From my perspective, a more scientific and logical mode, in my extended sense of logic, of talking about intelligence is in terms of capacity for tasks at the lowest level and life at the highest. Intelligence is perhaps best described, as a capacity for moral as well as material survival. Intelligence science has thus a unique philosophical dimension, since intelligence is above all a human phenomenon. In previous work, I've discussed the relation of information science and philosophy. Perhaps even more than they, intelligence science challenges the relative role of metaphysics and phenomenology in their implications for the society and the emergence of an intelligent society. We thus can see intelligence science as a science philosophy resulting from the convergence of the scientific and philosophical characteristics of intelligence, where intelligence is a conjunction of pragmatic and social capability. As a field, however, it requires further differentiation from that of cognitive science. So, excuse me a moment. Sorry. Some of the key principles for a satisfactory theory of our current society and of the way in which it should develop were laid out by the sociologist Christian Fuchs. In his 2006 paper, The Dialectics of the Nature-Society System, Fuchs defines nature as a self-organizing system that produces an evolutionary hierarchy of interconnected systems with specific qualities. Society is a product of nature where humans produce and reproduce structures that enable and constrain human practices in dynamic processes. Parts of nature are observed and appropriated by humans from within society, and these parts are socially constructed and form subsystems of society. Fuchs states that the relationship of nature and society is dialectical and both identical and non-identical, and this establishes a clear link to logic and reality. Is it acceptable to say that a society is an agent, that it is intelligent or possesses intelligence? To do so, of course, is a commitment to a systems theory that accepts the reality of collective action. A posteriori, it is always possible to say that a society of 3 or more individuals behaved in an intelligent manner as the consequences of prior communication, resulting in mutual agreement, at least for the purposes of some specific action. The locus of agency in this approach is not static. It is first in specific individuals and then extends to the collective configuration in which they find themselves. Information is indissolubly present in this situation as the medium of exchange in the communication and subsequent actions undertaken by the society. We can then ask, has our mini-society been intelligent and or displayed some form of intelligence in arriving at this point of interaction? Our preliminary answer for purposes of discussion is that our mini-society was intelligent if its behavior, or on a longer time scale, patterns of behavior, contributed to the survival and well-being of the individuals composing it. If these were further supported by the existence of the group, this is a secondary, albeit just as real advantage of the deployment of intelligence. However, it obviously differs ontologically, since a group or society is not a sentient entity. As Smiley put it, collectives do not have full-blown mental lives. But no group or collective, any more than any individual, exists in a vacuum. The interaction between groups in any real world, without unlimited sources of energy as heat or food, should be defined according to the degrees of competition and or conflict required for both to survive under any system of distribution. It is not possible for us to say today whether any form of behavior, selfish or altruistic, is more profitable to an individual or group in the long term, if not in the short term, or vice versa. Perhaps many of you feel that selfish behavior is always counterproductive globally, if not locally, or else our species would have ceased to exist. As you might by now expect, there is no simple single conclusion that I can or wish to make. Let me just call your attention again to some of the things that my logic and reality and associated dialectics are and are not. There are no propositions, syllogisms, or algorithms, mathematical or otherwise, in this logic. The basic epistemological ontological operator is implication. Truth is the truth of reality, not of statements about reality. The basic principle of LIR, of dynamic opposition, is a principle of relation. LIR is a logic of energy, of energetic relations, and the reference here is Ladyman and Ross's book, Everything Must Go. The complex phenomena of existence, physical, biological, and cognitive social, are dynamic processes with some temporary faults. Their parts moving between less than 100% to more than 0% actuality and potentiality. The principles of non-contradiction and of the excluded middle of standard binary logic are replaced by those of conditional contradiction and an included middle. Emergence of new entities takes place from the points of maximum interaction or contradiction between opposites. The basic dualities of time and space, continuity and discontinuity, identity and difference are not totally separate or separable in complex phenomena. There is no background space-time. The basis of morality is grounded in this physics, as human beings themselves are not totally separate from one another. Together, these principles, based on a transdisciplinary science and non-propositional logic, constitute the basis of a new synthetic philosophy. This logic and philosophy has immediate application in the understanding of human intelligence and the parameters of a potential intelligent society. The ultimate justification for supporting these principles is the degree to which they may contribute to the common good. Thank you. This is
Okay.
the end of my presentation. I would look forward to questions if I can get back to all of you.
Yeah, okay. So what I'll do, I'll share my screen. That will cause your screen to stop sharing, and then we can discuss. So and then I'll stop sharing my screen because you really don't want to see that, and we can see each other. All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Joseph. That was a wonderful presentation and very, very
I apologize for the I apologize for the interruption, and it was because I really was not lined out at the beginning. But okay,
you've got
let's see
nothing
how
to
it goes.
apologize for. It was perfectly clear what you were saying. So can I open the floor to questions, please? You can put your hands up or stick your hands up in Zoom. Wolfgang.
It appears to me that this was a great deal of presentation of meta information about LIR rather than what it actually is. So I have a couple of specific questions, whether or not you actually meant some of these statements. The first one being, you said intelligence above all is a human trait and not anywhere else. Does that mean you are not in any way, or this philosophy does not in any way support panpsychism or any of the assumptions that possibly there is intelligence in the natural world? So that's my first question. And let me leave it at that, and I'll ask the next one.
Yes, okay. So we should deal with that one.
I totally reject panpsychism.
All right. The other question I had is you talked about implication, I believe, as being the primary operator of this thing. Can you expand on that a little bit? What is, how do you use it? What does it operate on, and so on and so forth?
Very basic question. In this logic, there is a connection, as we saw, between things, real things, being actual and potential. And the operator that I've tried to categorize as an operator takes you from actual things to potential things by implication. Now, you have, in this case, to accept the basic principle of LIR, which I've just expressed in these terms, but the implications go to any type of complex relation. Something always implies, something actual implies its opposite as potential.
Could I apply that, for example, let's take something simple. Newton's laws, F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration.
Certainly not. Force equals
Not?
mass times
Okay.
acceleration, and we are in a domain not of theory, but of complex real processes. And what I'm trying to describe and differentiate, and to that extent, that's an excellent point you're making, is to make sure we all know very well what LIR is not. And it's certainly not going to replace the science and the mathematics, science and mathematics. But implication is being applied in this approach to a domain of reality and a domain of knowledge, which I feel has been rather neglected. And that extends, if I excuse myself to the speaker, also in not having a well-developed language for communicating on these subjects.
Well, I guess I'm bringing up the F equals ma question because in actuality, we observe acceleration. No one has ever seen a force, but it's implied so strongly that we believe force is as real as the acceleration, even though no one has ever, it's always an implication of sensation, touch, or other experience. So is that the type of relationship that you are dealing with here in this philosophy?
Yes, except I want to make sure that this is a dialectic, and it's the participants in these processes are influencing each other mutually. It's not a statement of F equals ma is not static, of course, but well, okay.
Okay, my last question has to do with, you mentioned there is no background space time.
Yes.
Does that imply that you're a proponent of Einstein's interpretation that ether is not necessary, or that there's no independent space-time outside of what a coordinate frame produces, or is that some larger or different concept?
I think that your phrase, what a coordinate system produces, may be the right one. If I go back to the founder of this philosophy, was Stefan Pascal, he described or attempted to describe, and please remember, these subjects have not received any discussion of this kind before today. He said that there is no, objects are not in space. Space is in objects. Objects unroll their own space and their own time, their own space-time. So objects are fundamental, and the observed phenomena of space and time are derivative.
Now, this is, of course, completely contradictory to the basic philosophy of quantum theory, which states that objects or observable facts are produced by the measurement process from a probability of getting a result. So are you introducing a new and different proposition here?
I am certainly not introducing a new quantum mechanics. When I prepared this talk, as it was my first, I was not sure of the dynamics, and that's a good example of my theory, nor of the scope that I should use. In my work, I have found, and I published a short article with Bob Bishop on this subject in the archive public series, about the relationship between my logic, quantum logic, and to what extent the principles that are in my logic define a macroscopic quantum logic that is better than other people's. Perhaps you're familiar with Diederik Eretz in Belgium, who has talked a great deal about macroscopic quantum logic, but he uses rather toy examples. And the concept of logic in reality is that it shares with quantum logic the fact that its elements do not compute and do not distribute, and therefore is an analog of quantum logic, but applied to macroscopic phenomena where there is sufficient dynamic interaction, sufficient dialectics, so that you're not talking about static objects or anything like that. Have I answered your third question?
Yes, but I think I just completely disagree with that answer. But
Okay, well, I think we should move on. So, Lot, I know, has a question.
Okay, Joe, that was a fantastic presentation of your work in 20 minutes.
Yes.
It's great. Yeah, you did a wonderful job. I have a couple of questions which more or less hang together. It begins with my feeling that there is a kind of jump towards that has to be a philosophy again. While I would expect information theory to be there in the central position, which you now attribute to philosophy again. That's a very general statement and a very general question. Okay, shall I take them one by one and leave you first?
Yes, please, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Why is it philosophy then in the center again? Why is it not information theory?
I have to fall back on what I don't want to appear as jargon, but can we separate them? Isn't the objective of the exercise to find some way in which, with all the specificities of subject matter, the important part of the philosophy and information in this concept of information theory as exchanges, but complex exchanges between people, aren't they in a sense the same, or not the same, but overlapping?
I see. And then eventually you choose for philosophy as on top of information theory.
I don't know that if you force me to.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
But is it necessary?
Okay.
I have no axe to grind. I say that at some time, information theory, qua theory, will be the discipline of choice. At another point, there will be a dialectic exchange of like the kind I just had, and other criteria for selection of dominance will appear. And that, in a sense, is the reality of logic in reality, and not not meta.
Okay, I get it. Yes, I get it. Can I go to my second point?
Please.
My second point has to do with the actualization and potentialization, yeah, which as black and white or hanging together, yeah. And I was wondering, I'm inclined nowadays to think about actualizations as phenotypical. Well, and that would mean that the potentializations are genotypical. Would you go along with such a rethinking of actualization, potentialization in terms of a kind of evolution theory? Because then the actualization is the variation, which is phenotypical, and the potentialization is the selection environment, the selection operating, which is deterministic. Would that resound with your type of theory, or would am I on completely different tracks?
No, I think talking about genotypes and phenotypes, philosophically, you could come to exactly what you're saying. I think if it's not that you're going to go into the lab, the biology lab, and start comparing samples, but I suspect in the philosophy of biology, which I don't claim to know as well as I should, that if looked at carefully, yes, they could fit as you go between a concept of phenotype and a concept of genotype.
But that would mean that potentiality has a different status than actuality, because potentiality is then deterministic, produced by selection environments, selection mechanisms, while actualization is historistic.
Actualization is non-deterministic? No, I'm sorry, you said that potentialization.
If it is genotypical, then it would be deterministic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the variation has a stochastic element and therefore cannot be deterministic.
Cannot be fully deterministic.
Yeah.
I agree. The point of where stochastic processes come in and how they are superimposed on the overall movement needs a lot of work. The one thing you know is that there is a flip at some point from actual to potential, and that flip is probably determined by stochastic principles. I'm not sure.
I would be inclined to say that the flip is determined by selection mechanisms.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, next time.
Let's discuss it, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? I've got a few questions. Christine.
Well, I've been sort of holding back reconstruction during all this because it's rather a sort of bugbear of mine, but I've been amazed that no one really has mentioned Derrida and Lacan and so on, but this seems to be the moment to bring in these sort of enemies of because I mean, Derrida's whole thrust is towards contradiction and not the excluded middle and so on. It's a whole movement that, for example, if you took Lacan, he has, as you probably know, three categories of discourse: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And it's the way that these categories relate to each other which is surely very relevant here. He says, for example, that the real is something we can't actually say anything about, but he still has to have a category called reality, which is the constructed things that we do. But I think that there's a leap between this kind of deconstructive theory and precisely the sort of social values and meanings that that the speaker it has been so good at formulating. For example, Lacan is a clinical psychologist, and he actually applies his theory of the impossibility of theory to helping people expand themselves as individuals and so on. And then there's so many things like, for example, how Platonic are these things and how not, and so on. And then there's Mallarmé, who is right in virtuality and says that the glorious lie of the soul and so on, that the conscious illusions that we have, all these are very sort of scientific, in quotes, or imaginatively precise ways of talking about this region, which is really, you could say it's apperception. It doesn't show up in the way biological and physical phenomena, but it doesn't mean it's not got a huge imaginative following out there. I don't want to go on too far there, but many of these people that I'm talking about call themselves anti-philosophers, but they do so in such a way that they are actually redeeming the values of philosophy by a discourse which is becoming very aware of its own metaphoricity. So I don't think there's necessarily a tension between, I mean, you can say you're an anti-philosopher and you still are actually within the realm of traditional philosophical questions. I just wanted to add that because I think that particularly in this country, deconstruction gets a very bad press. It was a sort of virus that was introduced into America. And so anyway, I'll stop there, but I really felt that your points tallied with many points in the deconstructive movement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I would very much like to learn more about this deconstructive movement, but I certainly can empathize with one author who I cite at some length in what I've done, and that is Derrida.
Yeah.
I am very glad that he has shown that you can get away from the strict limitations of imposed largely by not by science, but by the retention of the principles of binary propositional logic.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
calls, in fact, for a new kind of logic. As far as Paul is concerned, I will just base my comment about what the categories that you mentioned, and comment that I have some resistance to them as categories. The other thing, when one says about the real that you can't say anything about it, I rather tend to disagree, because even if you can't say something precise, and I think we could all agree there, you can have some good idea of what it is, and probably reality is something like what you think it is. And one can build on that and exchange ideas. Mallarmé, I unfortunately have no background in, but you've encouraged me to look into it. So thank you very much for that. I think you used the term also anti-philosophy. This is a subject that I've looked at, and as a matter of fact, not without some resistance, I have a chapter on anti-philosophy in my new book, and I go through the story there with the people that you know, and from Wittgenstein on down. So thank you very much for your comments.
Well, I only want to just add one thing to do with the discourses that I mentioned. I think they're the categories of the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. He presents them topologically as a Borromean concatenation where each one it cannot be separated from any of the others. So it's not really just simply dividing things up into categories. It's seeing how they're indispensable to each other. And I think that behind all that is an attack on humanism in a traditional sense, because once you move into this area, whatever you call it, it's almost like a land of non-existence and non-being, but it cannot be attributed with any wholeness, like the holistic thing, because as you said, you're immersed in it. Well, I better stop there, but I get tempted. Thank you very much for your paper and your comments.
Just one comment on your last series, and then Mark, I'll give you the floor back. You mentioned topological. Think of what you could do if you go from geometry, which is topology, to dynamics, which is about energy exchanges. Now, unfortunately, the people who develop these theories don't have that much science or physical science. And no one has, or few people have tried to put it in a way that it can be accepted. Or I would hope that it could be accepted that when, instead of always thinking in terms of topology and position, the age-old argument of which is more fundamental in the universe, position or energy change, could be resolved in at least equality, if not dominance of one over the other.
I think that actually the way that, oh, sorry, is it right? The way that topology is used there in psychoanalysis, for example, is a very sort of empirically documented view of the way that the Klein bottle analogy with inside and outside and so on, and the French have a wonderful say that englobant and englobé, the operator and the operandi, in the same system. I think these things are not at all vague. They're used in clinical psychology and in systems that involve language and ethics. And well, anyway, sorry.
Again, I have to comment because this is a way to make clear how I differentiate from some of these things. A Klein bottle is something like the famous picture of two hands drawing themselves of Escher, which Varela has referred to ad nauseam. And all these objects are binary in the sense that there's no dynamics to them. And the Big Bang is another story which we can't go into detail, but let us just keep in front of the house the concept of Penrose's cyclic universe, and that the conformal cyclic universe, where you can solve the problem of the size disparity after expansion and contraction, and you can have a saddle point or something else that takes you from one Big Bang sequence to the Big Crunch and back again, but without going through a singularity. So there's a lot here that is often discussed, I think, using examples that are themselves reductionist in an unsuspected ways. Sorry, I have a thing about that.
I think Derrida has a thing about it too, exactly.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, we probably should move on. Rachel.
Yeah, so thanks for your talk. Like 8 years ago, I read the Luciano Florido paper on informational realism and was trying to connect it to Husserl and Heidegger, and everyone in my school was like, what are you talking about? But I was a little bit confused by how you sort of wanted to speculate on reality in some ways, but not in others. And you had a sentence you said that I think was talking about metaphysics and phenomenology and sort of like where they stand in your system, but I didn't catch it. So I was wondering if you could repeat that.
Well, there are two entry points into your comments. One is easy, and the other one is quite difficult. As far as Floridi is concerned, Floridi's basic concept of information, which still underlines his current work, is that information is well-formed data.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not a concept of information. Information for me is informing, it's a process, it's an evolving set of, consider all the information that of all the things that you've been exposed to since you were born and can imagine now in informational terms. This is what Wu Kun has called the informosome. And that is something that is dynamic, extremely complex, and probably very difficult to pin down. As far as the discussion between phenomenology and my other distinctions, that was not so much a specific part of my talk. And it seems to me that I can't handle that right now. What do you think, Mark?
No, go for it.
Then you'll have to restate the question on the phenomenology.
I guess it wasn't so much a question, but I thought I missed something where you had something you said about where it stands in, I guess, your belief system. It's okay, you don't have to dive into it now.
I see. I think I know what you're referring to, but it's too, can't do it in this.
All right. Okay.
That's fair.
Okay. Joe, I wonder if I can ask a question. And it really goes back to Lote's question about the relationship between Shannon and the philosophy. And I suppose the question is, to what extent you can operationalize logic and reality? And do you not think that the Shannon emphasis does at least give us a way of making this empirical?
I know someone, I'm looking at his picture, who believes there's a lot more to Shannon theory and that can be done with Shannon than I have routinely given it credit for, and that is our friend Lote. I can't answer the question. It would take a course of study that is, I don't know if I can get into that. It seemed to me that there were things to bring out without that, but I can't say. There are just too many things to do. I'm willing to take that as a challenge. And that would, in any case, bring me back to look again at Leidesdorf and what he says on that specific topic. So fine, but I have to leave it there now.
Okay.
I think I have to leave the meeting then too.
Okay. Well, thank you.
No, I mean, leave that question. I was not leaving the meeting.
All right.
Okay.
Well, Lote, you're very welcome to leave the meeting, but I hope that we pick this up
No.
at some point in the future.
No, it was just a joke. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
Anybody else? Questions? Okay. Yeah.
Am I on here?
So, no, it was Divyaman.
Oh, you can go ahead if you wanted to go, Wolfgang.
Well, no,
Yeah, I
you
just
go,
want to make a comment about Shannon and specifically ask you, Joseph, because you mentioned that you were a chemist ultimately, but I knew Richard Hamming very well, who knew Shannon very well at AT&T. Richard Hamming was a a professor at my school for a long time, and I had lunch with him probably for 10 years, talking about precisely these things. He was under the impression that at AT&T, Shannon was specifically asked not to call his result entropy, just because it happened to have the same or a similar equation, because everyone thought that the entropy of chemistry was substantially different from the entropy of information that was promulgated. And I just wondered, as his name comes up, what's your feeling as a chemist on that? Are these in fact equivalent concepts, or are we talking about well, what Hamming said was that basically it was a joke?
Well, I think I will not answer the question, register the point about Shannon and when he was in AT&T, which it seems to me I've heard before, but try to take the opportunity from your question to go into where I think chemistry is relevant to the philosophical discussion we're having here. And for me, the key process or element of chemistry is the activation energy in chemical reactions. And there I see a kind of example of movement between actuality and potentiality, going through a kind of an included middle at the transition state. And if you have a background in chemistry, I throw the question back at you, and do you have a feeling for the transition state as a kind of logical intermediary? Could I convince you, for example, to think about it in such terms?
Not right off the bat, I'll tell you that. Not right off the bat, but my own feeling is that entropy is much more associated with some sort of a desire for material to reach an equilibrium state, and it's kind of a measure of how far a material is away from an equilibrium state in chemistry, which is quite different from the entropy of, say, an image analyzed in Shannon's way. You know, they're very different.
Can I make
Lois, could I?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. This is extremely important, because what Wolfgang just referred to is chemical equilibrium, which I think most of us have a feeling for. It's that point where you've done a titration and you've gotten to exactly the same amount of acid and base, and you're in equilibrium. And all I say, and in my discussion of chemistry and trying to look at transition states in chemistry, is that you cannot take a static or semi-static state such as equilibrium and draw any conclusions from it.
Can I, Lote, can you?
Yeah, I just wanted to react that the two concepts of entropy, the probabilistic entropy and the thermodynamic entropy, are very different, obviously different, because the one has dimensionality Joule by Kelvin, and that's brought in by the Boltzmann constant, and the H is a statistics.
Well, there's a difference too in terms of dynamics versus statics. I mean, Shannon entropy can be applied, and it's applied all the time to you know, the entropy of you know, someone sends an image and they say how much information there is and so on, and that's always there.
You can
Whereas chemical entropy is a dynamic thing. It's a measure of how, you know, there's a force there. There's a internal desire of material to change itself automatically into something, and that force is kind of measured.
So we agree that it is very different.
They're different, yeah, very different.
Okay.
Thank you, both.
Okay, any more?
Yeah, I had a
Right.
related question on that topic. Namely, I'm curious about your description of the relation as being complex, and if you really mean complex values or imaginary values, or are you just talking about complex relation as in it's a complicated thing that is hard to describe within a few sentences, or did you mean that there's a logical, like a dynamic that comes from interaction of complex numbers in some way, or how are you incorporating conditional contradiction and the included middle? Because I'm just curious about the math side of things, but because there are not that many slides demonstrating how this is really being actualized, and you did offer some definition of something coming out of a contradiction, or something coming out of you have something which implies what it's not, and something a dynamic sort of arises from there. So I'm curious about that, because I guess with Spencer Brown and of course Derrida, Lacan, I'm kind of curious about how they tie in, if they do.
Okay. The first part of the question is use of complex in the figurative sense. Omar,
Okay.
sorry.
No, it's fine. I was waving to Nicola. I'm assuming she's got her hand up to ask a question, and which she will do in due course. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was answering the first part of the question of Garayaman, and that is that it is complex in the figurative sense. As far as the representation of the operation of logic in reality, this is something I have set some guidelines for, but I've been unable to do because I'm the world's worst computer expert. And I simply said that you can state that the values of actuality and potentiality can be related as real and imaginary numbers. And you can plot, in fact, a line that goes between 100% actuality and 100%, or close to 100% potentiality. And you can draw some conclusions about that. I have not tried to write a chart like that, because probably it would be worse than anything. But the principle that you brought up is one that I think deserves work. I think there should be a way of plotting the, in fact, logic and reality should have the two sets of variables plottable on the same graph. That is the degree of actuality and potentiality, and the degree of identity and diversity. You simply go to another dimension of the graph. And I just am not able to do that. But the only requirement that I place on somebody who would do that is that the lines don't go through any of the axes, because the values of 0 are not, no real process goes to the absolute values of 0 or 1. So no crossing the axes.
You should try to do that in Excel, because then you can even picture it. Excel is extremely versatile with making a picture from it.
I would wish that Divyaman would do that for me. I would be delighted. I think we'd all learn something.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking for a job right now. So,
I think
yeah,
we've
sure.
got a little, we may have a little Anpa working group here. I think that would be an excellent little project.
Yes.
Okay, so Peter Marsa.
I would think you could.
You have to unmute,
say
Peter.
why you
Microphone.
disagree so much with the end.
Peter, you have to unmute. Sorry.
Microphone.
Microphone.
Microphone. Microphone.
Hello.
There we go.
Sorry about that.
Don't worry.
Well, I have a little paper here about the laws, he claims, of dialectical psychology, which it claims concern the unity and struggle of opposites, the transformation of quantitative into qualitative change, and the negation of negation. Can you tell us something about your particular form of dialectic along those lines, please?
All right. I regret that I missed the first part of your question. Could you please repeat it?
Yes, it says that Rydell laid down more or less the traditional dialectic laws of dialectic psychology, and he names the unity and struggle of opposites, the transformation of quantitative into qualitative change, and the negation of negation. Can you tell us how these might fit in with the dialectic that you have been telling us about?
Yes. First of all, I also regret, but the name of the author to which you were referring to was not clear. Who is this?
I think it's Rydell, but I don't know.
Rydell? Does anybody know?
Well, does it, well,
I'll answer the question, but I unfortunately could not seize the name. The transformation of qualitative to quantitative is a topic which is of great interest and I think can be studied usefully using my logic. As a matter of fact, I look for places or discussions like this which have the significant value that they give equivalent value, or at least some value, to the qualitative in opposition to the quantitative. Mm. The negation of negation, on the other hand, is another animal. It is a something about propositions, and there is negations are yes, no kinds of things, and there's no dynamics to it. So I could not follow you there. That's as much as I think I can say at this time. Negation of negation is a standard subject in standard logic, but not in mine. It doesn't exist.
Okay, well, fine. Thank you very much.
Christine, and then Mike Horner.
Well, unfortunately, I've had a sort of senior moment when I think of synthesis and, you know, antithesis, the dialectic. It's not Heidegger. Who is it? You know, the main dialectics. Of course it is. Well, I think that it's interesting. I mentioned Mallarmé. His central thing is negation of negation. And he sort of takes it from, who did you say it was?
Hegel.
I've forgotten it. Hegel. And shows that the actual stages, it's whether they actually dissolve or remain in the final thing. So negation of negation turns out to be making something out of nothing and not being able to be nothing other than a something, which well, just to, I thought of a sort of bon mot to end this, end myself on, which is, so far I keep dragging in the virus all the time. I've thought another way to drag it in here, because Camus wrote La Peste, obviously the plague, which is like what's happening with the virus all over again. It's not unprecedented, but he says that the absurd, it's not that life is absurd. He says that it's the gap between the human urge to impose meaning on the world and the world of nature, which creates the sensation of the absurdity, the death being the final absurdity. So I think that sort of relates to the idea of nothingness and so on, not being a nihilism, but opening the way for the human values as a refutation of absurdity by being absurd in themselves. You have to really end on a note of valuing ambiguity, what we don't know, indeterminacy, as the very source of making this sort of existential leap to try and refute absurdity and this terrible gap between, well, not terrible, but the urge to impose meaning on a universe that has none. And I think that links back to what the speaker said about the question. We still ask the question about wholeness, although we are actually, consciousness and being. We can't make statements about wholeness and being without being already in it, and that's the whole crux of absurdity. But absurdity itself, let's go on trying to refute it by interdisciplinary talks like this, as long as they know that they are impossible and can't get anywhere.
Lupasco has a substantial discussion of the absurd, and I have tried to pick up some of that. And there, it can be mined for a great deal of useful approaches. So I thank you for bringing that out, and it's something that certainly should be talked about more.
He knew Ionesco, didn't he?
Ionesco, yes.
The theatre of the absurd was Ionesco,
Yeah.
and
Lupasco and Ionesco did know one another and were friends, I think.
But actually,
Yeah.
Brower,
It's really
L.E.J.
Beckett.
Brower too
Beckett
talks
is
about
the-
absurdity
Sorry.
in a contradictory sense. Brower's lectures on intuitionism, you'd find him talking about
Yes.
absurdity in these contradictory ways.
Yes.
So it does sound really interesting.
And
that
Beckett.
Lupasco.
Beckett, who says, like, I can't go on, I can go on. That is an example of a contradictory opposition being used as another state, I both can't go on and I can.
And I go back to the point about Brower, because an intuitionist logic, I also saw pass in front of my screen somebody who was commenting on this. I just wanted to point out something about logic and reality, which is different from other systems that you may have been discussing. It's the only logical system that I know in which both the second and the third axioms of Aristotle are abrogated. And this means that intuitionist logic accepts a kind of included middle, which isn't really very dynamic, but it retains absolute non-contradiction.
Yeah.
Lupasco allows non-contradiction and an included middle. So you get out of that one. This should have been brought out more in the talk. Sorry.
Okay. I'm losing the plot in terms of my chairing. I forgot Nicola. So it is Nicola, then Mike Horner, and then John Torday.
Okay. Well, I mean, I was actually just stretching, which I guess is.
Oh, sorry. Well, I didn't realise. Well, if you're just stretching.
No. But in fact, I mean, so what I was going to say is that I'm very interested. I've just taken a photo, because I don't know how to do screenshots all that well, of your last slide, which was, these various points very clearly set out of how you see logic and reality. So I think I'm just gonna print this out, have a little look, and I'll probably be coming back to you separately.
Delighted. Thank you.
And you can watch the video again, of course.
I can watch the video. Yeah, absolutely. So
Okay,
thank
Mike.
you.
Okay. First of all, Joseph, I hope you didn't mind me exposing you to my Anpa friends. And you can see probably that Bob Bishop, the third person that you mentioned in your introduction. So I want to go right back to the beginning where you were talking about Niculescu and the movement, and you also mentioned Bertalanffy and general systems theory. Could you say where you are with this idea of, shall we say, getting the whole picture and the transdisciplinary movement going? Is it connected to the information at the philosophy level? Is there any progress there?
It's a very interesting question, Mike, and to the extent that, as you know, I have been working on and off with Niculescu for the last 20 years, and his whole concept of transdisciplinarity is very understandable to me. There are, however, two there are two panels to this transdisciplinarity. Niculescu uses it primarily in an epistemological task, and I use it on an ontological task. But it's something that is very much in the back of my mind, and transdisciplinarity is very much alive as a movement in November, starting in November and going on until next June. There will be an online conference like this one, in which will amount to the third International Congress of Transdisciplinarity. The offline part will take place some days in Mexico City. They haven't decided exactly when, but I will be talking about some of these things at that Congress as well. So transdisciplinarity exemplifies the principles of logic and reality in many ways. It refuses a narrow restrictions between disciplines. You can move freely from one to another, provided you maintain rigor, so it's not total freedom. These are all, seems to me, not compromises, but necessary actions. Sorry?
Please keep going, Joseph. Please keep going, Joseph. Okay, I have another question. Did you manage to see Mike Manthey's presentation when it was on earlier this week?
No, I did not.
I would wholly recommend that you look at that, because as I see it, you're both coming to the same holistic approach. I don't know if Nicola wants to add to that.
Oh yeah, I'm not muted, I can speak, okay. Yes, well, I mean, actually, the feeling I've been getting, I think, relates to what you were saying yesterday or the day before, Mark, about things coming together. I've had this idea, I've had this view that maybe not all of us, but quite a lot of what we're bringing in Anpa is like we're all looking at this elephant, which we might call reality, from different points of view. And it's a question of seeing how our languages and how our views actually might combine. So certainly, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, Mike's, Mike is coming from this combinatoric approach, Joseph. On the surface, it seems very different from you. But in fact, especially the thing is, if you listen to the talk, then you'll hear what he is doing through it. And then I think it would be very, very fruitful if you two can See, I mean, it's a pity Mike Mantley isn't here as well. So we must suggest to Mike Mantley that
Well,
he listens to you as well, Jake.
There'll be other opportunities. Is the elephant in the room, Nicola?
The elephant's always in the room.
Okay, all right. John Torday.
Well, yes, Nicole, I can come off of what you were saying. Mantley's schematic at the end of his talk, it's exactly like the vertical integration of physiology that I talked about. They are one and the same. And in fact, when Mike pointed out the fact that it's local, but also is non-local is exactly the same thing I was saying. But to Christine's comment about the absurdity of the universe, I think it seems absurd to us because we're looking at the whole damn thing backwards. That's what I keep saying. We are looking at it from the wrong end of the telescope. And it's only when you look at the process from its origins forward that things start to align. And now you can see the relationship between cell biology and quantum mechanics. And so, as a humanist myself, Frost said, life is that which can mix oil and water. He's exactly right. Eliot said in his poem, The Secret, round and round we dance, the secret sits within us, in the middle. Yeah, that kind of thing. But that's all well and good. But to Joe, to your talk, great talk. I firmly believe that there was no explicit Bohmian order until there was life. And what I would suggest is that the way that you transit from the explicit, what we think of as reality, to the implicate, which is what we're doing as empiricists has to be seen in the terms you're talking about, but there has to be a bridge between them. And otherwise, it's just correlations, associations, and opinions. I'll leave it at that.
The bridge, no, I think I could pick up exactly at that point. Start my talk again. Oh, I'm not going to do it.
We can go all night. It's okay.
But it would be a recursive process. I would go over again the way in which to make this work. In other words, you'd have to go again from the existence of two orders to the beginning of showing how they move towards one another or overlap or something, but they don't just sit there. If they just sit there, and I don't think Bohm intended that, but sometimes it's different. It's difficult to see what he did mean, because then I think he goes off and I don't understand. I would like to ask you then, if you understand the whole movement, is there anything real to that? That for me is where Bohm went off.
Yeah.
But any comments?
Yeah, but I agree with you.
The what
John,
movement?
The hollow movement.
Oh, hollow movement. You mean the fact that it's all one of a piece? Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, I'm a physiologist, so for me, it's evident. We are holistic. We only pull ourselves apart in order to try and understand the moving parts and then to put it back together again if we can, but it is a whole. So, and I think that the one piece that I wanted to mention in the context of Christine's comment about the absurdity, the reason I think that it is no longer absurd is because the central tenet of embryologic development is the endogenous, Lynn Margulis, she was a professor of mine, the endogenization of the external environment within the cell. That is the trick of biology. And then we compartmentalize it and we make it what we think of as physiology, but that's where the holism comes from the niche construction, which creates the continuum from the cell to Gaia. It's all one continuum. So if that's what you're saying, yeah, that is holism, and it is evident. It's just a matter of how you look at it.
I agree with this.
Okay. Okay.
I'm good with holes. I'm good with holes.
Yeah, okay.
Holes with
Is that with an H or a W?
I was just saying both. I like both.
Okay, all right.
So is a hole in one, is that philosophical?
Yeah,
or is that,
that's very good. Yeah.
Well,
I think
Lacan said that, never mind.
no, Christy, go on.
Well, I just said that holes, you know, that Lacan said that the virus points a hole in reality around which life falls away. But I think that the holistic point is surely it's the observer's mind that has this notion of wholeness. And so, of course, we can talk about holistic and wholeness, but at the same time, we have to realize the relativity of that remark to the structure always of our brains and our minds. So it's the statements that are holistic about the universe that are suspect, not the holistic movement of the brain itself to try and make wholes. And those two things often get confused, and people make statements about the universe as a whole as if we can know it, and not giving sufficient weight, in my mind, to the observer's role in it. So this everything in the future has got to be, as you were saying, how does consciousness relate to being? And that is a philosophical question, but it needs to go outside philosophy to be answered or not answered. And I like very much this interdisciplinary point that speaker's making. And because my work was on Valéry, who said that generality was his speciality, and he was a very interdisciplinary. He wasn't ashamed of it as being a little bit of this. It's not a ragbag, it's not a bricolage. It's an actual field, a subject, which is generality, which is very important. And he himself would have loved to be here, because he would go to all the different individual disciplines and ask the questions, which then became part of this other domain, the domain of questioning generality. So I really like the interdisciplinarity of Anpa, but it shouldn't be ashamed of this field that you've opened up, which is generality itself, I think. Sorry, it's just.
But I mean, I've gone on record to say that I think that because of the backward nature of the way we think about our existence, we've misconstrued consciousness.
Oh yeah.
Our consciousness runs off the consciousness of the cosmos. We are one with the cosmos through our physiology. That's how it has evolved.
Yes.
That is another statement I probably will agree with some slightly different language. But before that, I wanted to make sure there was a point that was not missed about bridging. Several people have used the term bridging, and the most recent is Louis Kaufman in the discussion, which is above the implicate and explicate order. And I don't know if this is in your system, Mark, but I would like to ask Louis to explain to me what bridging means between implicate and explicate, and if this is a dynamic bridging or a static epistemological bridging only, because it means that it makes a big difference, to me at least, as to what level of reality to give to these terms.
Can I take a crack at that? I've said Maslow peak moments, near-death experiences, that kind of thing. The integration of physiology such that our calcium waves are all in sync, and we are now we're now resonant with the cosmos. Those things really do happen.
I'm a chemist. I can accept that. From the philosophical point of view, it still seems that the emphasis in talking about the implicate and explicate order, not you, but has been not you, Jorn, but others, has been to differentiate between the two orders. And our discussion, and maybe applied philosophy and synthetic philosophy and alternative philosophy are all about that same way of looking at things, is to look for bridging that is active and not divisive.
Okay, so Luke has written his answer in text.
I can address this a little bit from possibly your initial concept that you introduced, which is everything is dynamic and change and so on and so forth, as well as John Day. I think when you make a statement such as about the universe, you have to grasp the fact that the universe as a reality out there is an unknowable. You're always talking about our own relationship to the model that we have built to interactions, to explain interactions. We have internal models. Those internal models are a creation of ourselves, which is the universe that we think we live in. And the bridge is to understand that we're constantly interacting, explaining interactions into visualizations, which then drive our actions into that unknowable outside. Unless you, and so we're talking about a dynamic process that goes between objective and subjective and objective, and it's understanding that process that becomes the bridge. It's an active activity between objective and subjective experiences. We do it all the time.
Yeah, I'm an empiricist. I spent 50 years at the bench, but I did a critical experiment. I put lung cells and bone cells in microgravity in this NASA-approved contraption, and those cells become comatose. Others have shown that yeast do the same thing. It demonstrates the intimate relationship between electromagnetic force and biology. Electromagnetic force has created the biologic premise. That's totally objective, in my opinion. It's not subjective and opinion. It's a real thing. It's an experimentally demonstrable thing.
It's still an out there thing that it takes a you personal to interpret and come up with the theory that explains it. You're the one that's doing that all the time. You can't get rid of yourself.
There's always a
Well,
relationship.
no, but I mean, in my deconvolution of, I'm a lung biologist by training. So in my deconvolution of the alveolus of the lung, all the way back to the unicell, each individual step, phylogenetically, ontogenetically, was based upon experimental evidence. So, you know, as opposed to the binary kind of hypothesis testing, the either or thing, these are all linked events. So when, you know, when Conrad Bloch discovered cholesterol by a synthetic pathway, he said, oh, it's because there was enough oxygen in the atmosphere for that to happen. That's reasoning after the fact. That was in reference to the lipids that traveled with the frozen water on those asteroids that we know created the primordial ocean on the Earth. And then the lipids are submersed in the water and they create micelles. These are primitive cells. Those are all facts. I've just linked them together in a narrative that provides experimental opportunity. And most of it's testable. All of it's testable. So I understand what you're saying, Wolfgang. I'm not a metaphysician. I'm a scientist. But I do think that there are ways in which we can deconvolute the process, in which, by looking at it in a systematic way that is interconnected through physical, chemical, and biochemical principles.
And could you say that imagination is involved in both? I mean, Vladimir said that we speak from a central attitude from which the operations of science and of art are both possible. They're different forms of the imagination. But when we think there is a bridge there, because obviously the physiology you're talking about is involving a high degree of imaginative leaps, which it's almost as if it's the other way around, perhaps, in the arts, but it's this central attitude that is the main thing here, I think. And whether that is Popper's fourth world, I don't know, but I thought that perhaps Joseph would know about that when he speaks of the fourth world. Is that the same as the exclusive world, or is it just the world of minds together, or what is it? I don't know. Just a...
I've looked at Popper's fourth world, but I was not particularly impressed, so that it has not left much of a residue. I like very much as a for his social theory, and a little bit less for his for the rest of it. I have a falsifiability theorem, which I will offer, that's a supplement to Popper, and that is that if there is no kind of of what I've tried to express today in my logic going on in a theory, probably it's not right. The other question on the sorry, the question about the collapse of the wave function, I don't think it's a necessary thing. I think one needs to discuss about these things without recourse to that mechanism at a quantum or subquantum level, but okay.
Oh, Christine, can I just say that I think that you're right. It is it's creativity, but creativity driving experimentation. Everything we do is empiric. It's all about that. And that's why the transdisciplinarity is so important, because the truth lies in the Venn diagram between all of the various experimental efforts that we make. I mean, when I play tennis and I hit a tennis shot, I'm asking my opponent, do you know that I'm asking a question? And if they can respond, they give me an answer. So there's a, you know, there's a chemistry between us, for example.
And that your empiricism is part of your empirical capacity is part of the way that the human mind works as part of the universe. So again, it's not necessary to have a subject-object distinction quite so much. That's a binary thing, isn't it? But we can't throw it away, because there's still a difference between the conscious awareness, the language-making animal, the tool-making animal. They come together. I liked your image about the, and after all, my name is Crow, so I am a tool maker and a linguist. So.
Well, but
let me
you know,
jump in here for a second, John. Let me give you an example. Can I give you an example that I fully understand the complexity of what you've been doing with so on and so forth, but let me reduce it to something. Assume for a second that you're an astronomer, okay? Mm-hmm. You look through a telescope and you possibly put a camera in front of it, and you are, and I frankly had this conversation with Charles Towns of all things, because he was my thesis advisor at Berkeley. But okay, so you're an astronomer, you point your telescope, you make a measurement, you have a photographic plate. Okay, the question is now, is there, and a normal astronomer would then say, I've made a measurement on a star. But now look what's actually happened. What's actually happened is that you've taken an external instrument, you've made a measurement, you've looked at the result of the measurement, and you are explaining it in terms of projecting mentally that there is a star out there, that you've just got some information. That projection, the subjective element, the theory building, all of that stuff is part of the whole system, and you can't get rid of it. As a scientist, we have been brainwashed into eliminating the observer and our own relationship, and that is the mistake, and we need to fix it.
In my realm, that was true up until 1981. You know, with molecular biology, you can knock things out, you can knock things in. So in your analogy or your metaphor, I'm Archimedes. I'm going to take the lever and I'm going to manipulate what I saw. And if I manipulate it in a hypothetical way where I predict that it will go in a certain direction or not, that's totally different from observing and making subjective conclusions. That's the huge difference. You know, the experimental manipulation and prediction, especially when they're linked predictions. No? Or am I missing something?
No, John, you're not missing something, but the point that Wolfgang was making was something else. It's
Joseph, go on.
okay. What he was trying to.
Wait a minute, I got some feedback.
I think we need to mute because we're getting feedback.
Right, go ahead.
Wolfgang started making a comment there, which has now disappeared. The point was that there was some kind of an interaction and that needed to be kept in mind and that scientists weren't doing it. And that is what, in fact, these interactions, including those between us today, are part of the science and not just part of the, even if they're not experimental in the same sense as John's. I think John is absolutely right in what he's saying about the science, and where Wolfgang's comment, which he might reproduce, is more philosophical in a good sense, and has to be included with the same, given the same value that John's comments are. And this is perhaps a way of thinking that is, of course, congenial to me since I'm pushing logic and reality. But this is why what I think it's about. No one is, I notice a certain defensiveness on the part of John, and I'm willing to follow his historical development, but it's not the whole story. And there is something that I'm, as a fledgling philosopher, trying to add to it that is more along the lines of what Wolfgang is saying. Okay, that's my comment. Of course, Lewis says that eliminating the observer is a mistake. But this is what this discussion is all about. It's not an either the observer or not. It's it's finding the right place for him, so to speak.
Right, folks, I think we should probably stop. First of all, Joseph, can I thank you for what has been a really stimulating session. Really, you brought a completely different flavor to our discussions here, and I think it's been wonderful. So thank you so much. I hope you've got as much out of it as we have.
Thank you very much, all of you, for your comments. There's much to study there, and you've shown me very clearly a couple of things that I have not brought out in the interests of time, but let's do it again.
Yeah, definitely. We must do it again, and please stay in touch with Anpa, because this is really good. This is really rich. Okay, so tomorrow, John. And now you're still going to talk about light is heavy, but you're going to talk about something completely different, I think.
No, I'm going to talk about light is heavy and something completely different at the same time, but connected.
Okay, your sound is very fuzzy. I don't know if you can.
Okay, no, I think this. Okay, no. No, light is heavy is still the title, but I'm going to bring in some of the Clifford algebraic things as well and the connections that exist between that and light being heavy.
Great.
So,
okay, well, look forward to that. And thank you ever so much, everybody, because it's been such a stimulating and I think we've touched on some very important things this evening. So, or this afternoon, whatever. I think it's been really valuable, and I very much appreciate, Joseph, you coming. So thank you to everybody. See you tomorrow.